Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Cedar.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Wednesday, July 1st, 2020. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps and steps and steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Professor of History at the New School, Federico Finchelstein, on a brief history of fascist lies. Meanwhile, 45,000 new cases, nearly 130,000 dead. The U.S. 7-day new cases has doubled since June 13th, and our federal government's response is virtually nil. Oklahomans, however, vote to expand Medicaid to 200,000 people in their state under the auspices of the Affordable Care Act. And in Colorado, a QAnon supporter beats a 5-term congressman, Republican congressman, in a GOP primary in what is a Coloradan swing district. Speaking of Colorado, Hickenlooper wins. That stinks. The Senate extends the Paycheck Protection Program. Democrats unveil an ambitious but not quite Green New Deal. Trump threatens veto of a defense bill over Confederate named bases. And without emergency funding, our entire immigration system is going to shut down within a month or two. Republican Senate strips a provision from an Intel bill requiring campaigns to report foreign election help. That's weird. And a federal court decides that Trump administration's third country asylum rule is invalid. All this and more on today's program. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. It's hump day. We've made it to another Wednesday, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you're doing well. In certain parts of the country, things are getting a little bit terrifying. I think there are 2 states in the country where numbers have gone down today, and it was, I believe it's Connecticut and Rhode Island. Oddly enough, not sure what it is about those 2 states. But, and of course, in places like Arizona and Texas and Florida, California, seeing explosive growth in the infections. We are not there yet in terms of deaths. Hopefully, we'll never get there in terms of a commensurate amount of deaths. But remember, when we get a report that the 7-day new cases has doubled since June 13th, okay? So we're talking 3 weeks ago. These people were infected 3 weeks ago. And so deaths are a little bit of a lagging indicator, but we are outside of the window of where we would see more deaths. It really is a function of the age of people who are getting the COVID-19. A reminder, and I think I've heard that there's more Facebook groups that are being created for folks who have recovered from COVID-19 to talk about their medical problems that they're having. Significant medical problems that people have that could theoretically plague them the rest of their life. But at one point, the average age could, not necessarily, but I would say likely, go from 36, which it is now in these outbreaks that we're seeing in places like Texas and Arizona and Florida. And if it gets up to like in the mid 40s, then we're going to have a severe problem, I think, in terms of fatalities. We're also, there's the potential of problem when it comes to fatalities if the capacity of our medical system is overrun. So wear a mask. Apparently, Republican leaders now are circling back around to the idea of wearing a mask. It protects those around you. I think it probably protects you to some degree, maybe even more than we know, even if it's a non-N95 mask, but it certainly protects other people. And just to be clear, this is because those droplets that come out of your mouth when you talk, they go into the air. Some hit the ground, some evaporate and aerolize, and those are the ones that can be very problematic for other people. Certainly a droplet, if it lands in your face, it will be. But it's the aerolization of these droplets. When you block them with a mask, and you don't know, maybe you're asymptomatic, you're limiting the amount of aerolization of these droplets that are in the air, and so it's harder for people to catch. That's just basically it. One would imagine that 4 months into this, everybody would know this, but they don't, because our federal government did not marshal any of they didn't bother to marshal any of the resources that we have in this country to deal with it. So, all right, let's go with this. Joe Biden's numbers continue to go up in poll after poll. Donald Trump's continue to sink. We are seeing more and more reports that Republicans are getting very worried. When you see things like a QAnon sympathizer win in a swing district, beating the incumbent Republican, it gives you a sense that there may be, and I don't know that people expected there would be pickups in the House, but it's very possible. We could see a significant number. I mean, we're at the high end of what would be the potential in terms of pickups in the House, but we could see even more maybe pickups in the House. Conceivable. We have a long way to go with this election. I mean, we still have the alien invasion to happen. We still have the lightning to strike Joe Biden, and what else do we have on par? I'm not quite sure what it is.
It's been kind of quiet on nukes lately, so maybe we can get some of that.
I mean, there's about a half dozen other things I think that are going to happen between now and then that are just going to be insane. But for the time being, the Republicans are having a really tough time running against Joe Biden because in many respects, he's barely there. And this is proving to be a fairly effective strategy on his part. They are really fumbling around. Here is Laura Ingraham trying to articulate the fear that Republicans should have of Joe Biden and therefore go out and vote for Trump. And it is really, this is just, she needs a break, I think, just like I do. Let's play this.
And perhaps my favorite misstep of the week was when Joe Biden stumbled into making a clear and truthful statement on a call with big donors. He said, I'm going to get rid of the bulk of Trump's $2 trillion tax cut, and a lot of you may not like that. Well, of course, we know that's going to do wonders for all of your 401ks in the midst of a pandemic that caused an unemployment crisis. So I
Wait,
recounted all this tonight because
pause it for a second. What? He's talking to big donors. We're going to roll back the tax cuts, and that's going to impact the 401ks. I don't even understand even the logic on her part. She's trying to make literally like he's going to roll back the tax cuts for wealthy people.
Yeah, trickle down.
But I don't like how would that implicate the 401ks?
Well, it trickles down.
Yeah, I guess so. All right. I mean, I don't know how, but like that's like trickling sideways. I'm not sure, but let's continue.
Pandemic that caused an unemployment crisis. So I recounted all this tonight because all of these blunders are actually really good news for conservatives, even if some of the underlying news is terrible for the country. But now it's time to communicate all this. If Biden wins, he will support defunding the police, a policy that will lead to lawlessness and disorder. I don't care what he's promising you now. And if Biden wins, every American will be paying more taxes, not to pay down the debt or help the elderly, but to give AOC and company more money to wreak havoc on the country that you love, meaning more anti-American propaganda in the schools, more attacks on the nuclear family, and the big Green Deal. Well, that's going to be a big new cram down. You'll be sending money to Washington so Pelosi and the squad can commission statues of their new heroes of the left, like, I don't know, Colin Kaepernick and Stacey Abrams.
You know, my favorite part is I don't know, like I'm just going to pull this out of my hat and just coincidentally, we're going to have the pictures ready for the graphic. She's like, how many people do you think in her audience even know who Stacey Abrams is? It's just a picture of a black woman that she's able to put up. So the pitch is don't vote for Joe Biden because he's going to raise taxes and give the money for a cram down on the Green New Deal to AOC, who's going to erect statues of black people. It's tough to put that on a bumper sticker.
Isn't she supposed to be suppressing the vote? or depressing the vote, I should say.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think she's got to be as exhausted as I am, and just to run out of things. Maybe that's the thing is there's no toehold. I mean, if you've got to go from don't vote for Joe Biden through the machinations that will call for a statue made of Stacey Abrams, I really think that you have not figured out what you're going to run on or run against in this instance. And I mean, I get that Laura Ingraham, it's always low hanging fruit for her to go from, to immediately a fear of a black planet. But man, there's just no sophistication in this. And there's it's overly sophisticated. It's like a Rube Goldberg machine that they've developed over there. Don't vote for Joe Biden or you're going to get statues of Stacey Abrams. Folks, just a reminder, this program relies on your support. You can become a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll be talking to Federico Finchelstein. He's the professor of history at the New School for Social Research and Eugene Lane College on a brief history of fascist lies. Be right back after this. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of History at the New School for Social Research and Eugene Lang College, author of A Brief History of Fascist Lies, Professor Federico Finchelstein. Welcome to the program.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I want to just start with, you know, I should say you obviously you write about fascism quite a bit from a historical perspective. Your last book, Fascism to Populism. But give me a sense of what it is, particularly in this topic of fascist lies. What inspired you to write this book? I'm interested, you know, more or less, I guess, like in your personal history of growing up under I guess, arguably a fascist regime.
Well, I mean, there are different answers to that question. One dimension, of course, is the biographical one. The first 10 years of my life, I live under a dictatorship that was inspired in a history of fascist ideas. And this dictatorship decided that people that did not think the way the generals wanted them to think were regarded as terrorists, and basically they were kidnapped, tortured, and eventually disappeared, quote unquote, which is to say that these people were killed without anyone knowing about their whereabouts. Now, this dictatorship did in Argentina the dirty war, and by what is interesting is that in fact the irony or the contradiction was that these dictators were calling members of the opposition terrorists, but in fact they turned the state into a terrorist actor. So that's why historians of Argentina, we talk about the state terrorism. Now, of course, this is very worrisome when you see the same kind of language coming from the White House.
Let's talk about how you started off your book. You had 3 quotes. And I have to say, at the very least, this one, you must believe me because I have the habit. It is in the system of my life of always and everywhere saying the truth. That sounds like Donald Trump in many respects. But of course, that was not the Trump quote that you used. That was one from Mussolini. So you had a quote from Trump, Hitler, and Mussolini. What is the difference between the lies that a fascist or would-be fascist tells and just the lies that politicians, broadly speaking, tell?
Yes, I mean, lies are part of politics. As you know, I mean, all politicians lie at one point. But the big difference between a fascist and other types of politicians is not only that they lie more, so here we have a big difference of quantity, but a qualitative difference as well, which is that they either believe their lies or they believe that ultimately their lies are at the service of a larger transcendental truth, which is the truth that emanates from the cult-like leader. So basically, I mean, and going back to your previous question, I was always interested, both for personal reasons, biographical reasons, as well as you know, scholarly reasons, to understand why people believe in these lies. This is not only about the technique of propaganda, but rather that this propaganda is believed by many. So what people, why people will find meaning in these lies, and eventually they will be willing to die or even kill for them. So there is a kind of a very problematic outcome of this form of lying that we saw in the past with Hitler and Mussolini, and I'm afraid we are seeing now with Donald Trump, which is that by denying facts, by denying science, and denying reality, they change reality, and people die as a consequence of this. I mean, from not wearing masks to putting people in concentration camps.
Give us maybe I should have started with this, but give us a definition of fascism. So when we're talking about a fascist leader, and you know, I mean, there's obviously a leap between Hitler, Mussolini, and then Trump. But give us a definition of what what fascism, what a fascist leader is.
Yes, and by the way, I would like to stress the fact that I don't think Trump is a fascist yet. Trump, and I will go back to this very soon before I will answer your question, but Trump, I mean, is a populist leader that would like to be in a fascist situation, but he's not. And that depends, of course, on the rest of us to, if we, to stop that. Now, going back to your question, what is fascism? I mean, fascism is an ideology and a form of government that always stands for putting violence and the glorification of violence, racism, and this type of life at the center of its politics. And in addition to that, and last but not least, fascism always is a form of dictatorship. So it's an extreme, radical, extreme right ideology that proposes dictatorship and persecutes those that either behave, think, or simply are different to what the fascists regard as a homogeneous people.
So, I mean, in the context of Trump, obviously he's not a dictator. So that is a major element. But he has centered, I think it's fair to say, to some extent, I mean, to a significant extent, race and racism in his leadership. I mean, he ascended in the Republican Party as attacking the, basically calling Barack Obama, the other, as it were, because he was an alien who was not born in this country, shouldn't have been president. And certainly he has nibbled at the edges on promoting violence at various times. And so it's really just sort of, it is his inability to have assumed and to concentrate power. Is that basically what keeps him within the realm of just being a right-wing populist?
Yes, but I mean, I think you are absolutely right also in stressing what makes Trump close to the fascists as well. I mean, because, in my previous book, From Fascism to Populism, I explained how after 1945, when fascism was defeated, many dictators and many fascists decided or realized that that kind of politics, meaning putting racism at the center of politics, putting violence at the top, and certainly, wishing for dictatorship to be, was toxic in the post-war war. So these dictators, these fascists, as opposed to what the fascists did before, which is, as you know, Hitler and Mussolini used democratic means to destroy democracy from within. So these populists, people like Juan Perón in Argentina or Getulio Vargas in Brazil, after 45, they were dictators. And as opposed to what the fascists did, destroying democracy from within, these dictators destroyed the dictatorship from within in order to create new electoral democracies. They carry on key elements of fascism, but also they left behind three, or I would say four key elements. And these elements were the glorification of violence, racism being at the center of politics, as you just mentioned, the technique of lying, which was rather typical of fascism, and of course, dictatorship. Now, that was the history of populism until recently, when people like Trump emerged. Because, from left to right, people like the Kirchners in Argentina, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, but also right-wingers like Fernando Collor de Mello in Brazil or Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, they kind of, as right-wing as they were, they never put racism at the center. And occasionally, these people were racist, occasionally they were violent, but they were not as, let's say, pro-dictatorship, pro-violence, and pro-racism as the fascists were. Now, what happens is that we see a change in the history of populism, because with people like Trump, with people like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, with people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, or even Narendra Modi in India, what we see is that populism is going back to some key elements that earlier populists, throughout the 20th century have left behind. So we see a return in populism to key elements of fascism. As you rightly point out, Trump started his campaign with racism. We should remember that he went down his kind of golden stairs in his Trump Tower, and he accused Mexicans of being rapists. He started with a racist statement. So this used to be toxic in politics. Early populists will see that this was problematic. racist populists like George Wallace never made it into the presidency because of this. And Trump basically showed that that in a way racism and violence were useful again for populists. Now, the result of that is that then we see a populism that is very close to fascism. It is violence. It is extremely violent in terms of its glorification and eventually in its practice. It is extremely racist. It lies like the fascists, and yet it lacks the dictatorial dimension. So we are not seeing full-fledged fascism yet. And as I said, it depends on the rest of us to stop this. Meaning, Trump would like to be a fascist, but it's unclear he will be able to.
And it, you know, who knows who's going to adopt his mantle after he is gone. But since you brought up your earlier book, I just want to talk about like one thing that from your earlier work that I thought was pretty interesting and relevant here is that U.S. populism before 1920. In that book, you break it down into three basic eras of populism and fascism and pre-1920, essentially, in between 1920 or 1918 and 1945, and then post-45, which you just sort of touched on. But your discussion of populism in that book was a right-wing, a populism that starts amongst like, farmers and small producers. But when it gains strength and becomes part of the government, there is a reconciliation between these small producers and corporate and finance capital. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Because, the idea of we've just had a left-wing populist movement in this country. I think we have a growing one, but one that played out. It did not win in the Democratic primary. But there are some who are talking about the similarities between left-wing and right-wing populism. And I'm curious as to the extent that they exist, if you could talk about those, but also those key differences.
Yes, I think, in my own approach, I stress the fact that when I say there are authoritarian elements in populism that also include left populism, I'm referring particularly to two ideas. One is the cult of the leader, because even, in populism and modern populism after 45 carried that from fascism. You see the idea that rather than being a representative of the people, the leader of a populist movement is the one that decides for us. In a way, he's not only, and generally was a he, in terms of reaching power, he's not only our representative, but he presents himself as the personification of the people. So thereby, whoever is against the leader is an enemy of the people. Now, the point is that, and I will return to this issue of what are still the key differences between left-wing populism and right-wing populism. But let me refer to the recent Democratic primary, because I don't think someone like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren were populist. In the U.S., generally, there is the tendency to somehow conflate popular demands and actors or politicians that respond to those political demands with populism as such. Populism also involves the idea of a leader that is best than the rest of us, and we should just sit in the back seat and do nothing. So I don't think that people like Warren or Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez, among many, represent that populism. They are basically left-wing politicians that represent popular demands. So populism is something else. It is the idea that not only they represent popular demands, but rather they know what popular demands are even better than the rest of us. So there is an idea of, in a way, switching from representation to delegation. We delegate all power on these leaders. Now, but then we see this populism of the left in other situations and countries. For example, the case of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or the case of the Kirchners in Argentina. These were politicians that generally stood for, sometimes, actually, not all the time, but generally stood for sometimes progressive measures, but at the same time, they were authoritarian and vertical in the sense that they believe whoever was against these ideas that they had was a member of or an enemy of the people. So we don't see at all that in people like Sanders. So I think it's misleading to call him a populist in terms of my own interpretation. Meaning, I have a very technical and scholarly notion of populism, of course.
Fair enough.
Now, going back to the differences is that once you have populists, let's say someone very authoritarian populist, which sometimes will be presented as being on the left, such as the former Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez. So Chavez still, even if he was authoritarian, there were many, let's say there were important differences between, let's say, this sort of left-wing populism and the current right-wing populism. Because the idea, in a way, starts with the same premise. The idea that whoever stands with the leader, that is the people, or those are the people, and whoever is against is the anti-people. So you see this, right?
Yeah.
But in the left-wing version of populism, basically what you have is that this is a place that can change suddenly, and it relies on political identification, on what you think politically. It doesn't matter, what color your skin is, or other types of, thoughts or behavior. So it's really a political notion of the people, the authoritarian notion of the people that the leader has, in the sense that if you are with him, you are with the people. If you are against, you are against the people. So in that sense, the current populism of the right, such as Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil, they adopt a more, if you will, more fascist version of this. Because for them, the people are not only, those citizens that agree with them, but also they conflate that notion of the people, which is rather traditional and rather extended in the history of politics, meaning the people are those that have a certain types of ideas. That's it, right?
Yeah.
But they conflate that with what the fascists did, which is a more an ethnic/religious notion of the people.
Okay.
So which are the base? Which are the real base? The real people for Trump? Well, they are white Americans that are also Christian. And the same you can see in Hungary, the same you can see in Brazil. And this is not really like the typical populist version of who the people are. So, I mean, in a non-populist version, the people are all of us, right? It doesn't matter whether we disagree with each other, we are all the people. For populists, let's say before Trump, the people are those that identify with the leader. After Trump or with Trump, the people are those that identify with the leader, but generally the real people are those that are white and Christian. So you go back to this fascist ethno-religious notion of the people. This is a kind of mix, right? The fascists did not have the ideas part. It was only who was Aryan and Christian, okay? Whereas for someone like Trump, he mixes this. People that vote for him, but also, people that are white and Christian.
I see. So when we're talking about, so when we're talking about the left populists, it is almost an authoritarianism that is a function of ideology of some kind, and on the right, it is one that is an authoritarianism that is more identitarian, I guess.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
And
exactly.
so, and what about that concept of, because your description of populism sounds very synonymous with authoritarianism. That relationship between the followers and the leader is an authoritarian dynamic.
Yes, but populism has a kind of, there are two sides to the populist coin, let's say, because there is the authoritarianism, but there is something, and let's go back to this idea that populists after 1945 left behind key elements of authoritarianism and fascism. So there are authoritarian ideas, but also they are mixed, conflicted, but also mixed. They are a hybrid because they are mixed with democratic ones. So who is the one that rules? The person that is voted. And that's why populists are obsessed with elections. And that's why in the history of populism, I mean, the idea is that you don't have, let's say, a pluralistic idea of the people or who are the majority. So the people become only the majority that agrees with the leader. The minorities in populism, they are delegitimized. They don't have legitimacy because they are not the real people. Now, nothing happens to them in a populist democracy. They are symbolically demonized, but nothing happens. They are not persecuted, and they still have the ability to vote against the leader. Now, the leader says, you don't like me, vote me out. the majority voted for me, so if you don't like me, vote me out. If you lose, then you are not the people, but you will keep your rights. Whereas in fascism, there is no thing like that, in the sense that minorities are imprisoned, exiled, and eventually killed. So there is no place for the minority in fascism or dictatorship. And in the populist, let's say, a way of authoritarianism, what you have is a mix. There are, let's say, authoritarian, basically the language is authoritarian, which is bad enough, but the practice is not. And that's why I'm so concerned about someone like Trump, because what you see is that he goes beyond the language. He seems to go back to things which were not typical of populism, but rather typical of fascism. So we have in Trump a new hybrid in a way, a mix not only of populism and democracy, but a mix of those two with fascism again.
Is it a hybrid, or are we simply, or is it, or from a conceptual standpoint, are we looking at a hybrid, or are we looking at a matter of degree, that you're moving along a spectrum and that you need to go through this part of, to get from place A to place B, or Z, you're going through some of those other letters in the alphabet, and that's what, in some sense, that's what we're doing. I mean, Trump may not be able to get all the way, but we're heading down a certain path.
Certainly, and as an historian, I really like the way you put it, because this is a process. So at this point, it's a hybrid, but we see. I mean, it's difficult to see which is the end point. But we see that there has been a deterioration of democracy in this country, and Trump's authoritarianism has increased over the years, over days even. So, and certainly, radicalized by the current pandemic, and his ability to downplay important institutions of the state, appropriating them, militarizing politics, and all the things that your listeners know about what the president is doing. So yes, this is we see that he has been trying. We don't see the end point. Hopefully, the end point will be, him losing in elections. But we see that he has been trying to, in a way, depart from, let's say, the more democratic dimensions of populism, and even to some extent depart from some key populist dimensions to turn into a more dictatorial or even fascist situation. He has not been able to do so, and as I said, hopefully he will not be able to do so. So it's hard to say historically whether Trump is a fascist in the making, because we don't know what is going to happen. Historians, we always have hindsight, and we know what is going to happen. At this point, it's a matter of speculation, but certainly we can say, and I can say this as an expert on both fascism and populism, that what we see is that here you have a populist that is really making the populist dimension, certainly the democratic ones, and trying to approach fascism or dictatorship with a fast pace. Again, there are a lot of steps that he will need to take, and I'm not so sure the rest of us will allow him to do so.
Yeah, I want to get to that part about how we prevent that, but I also want to just zero in, and then I want to get into more about the specifics about the dynamic of lies. But before we do, this concept of fascism coming via an individual, I want to read a quote to you, because what you talk about in terms of lies, and we'll get there in a moment. This quote stuck with me, in part because the journalist who was expressed to had imparted it to me years ago. But it is he was talking to an aide of the president, and he was told that the journalist was told that guys like me, not me personally, but this is the journalist, are in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We're an empire now. When we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. That's how things sort out. We're history's actors, and all of you will be left just to study what we do. You write that the lies that are being told by a fascist are the reason why their followers are immune from those lies being disproved is because they are speaking towards a greater truth that is like normative and aspirational. that quote was from the George W. Bush administration. So I wonder if there isn't a very fertile ground that Donald Trump is working with, that he is tilling more than seeding.
Yes, I mean, that is an important quote. Like, if you take this quote individually or out of its context, I will say it ranks very high in the fascist scale. Now, the question, of course, regarding the Bush administration is to what extent they were willing to go all the way in these beliefs, in their own lives. And to me, the impression that I have is that they were more traditional in the way they approach life, more hypocritical, if you will, someone like Dick Cheney and so on. Whereas what I see here, of course, there is the result of the statement like that, and were very consequential. But even then, you didn't see this demonization of the press. And here, the press is very important because it is through the press, through journalists, that we citizens are able to gather facts in order to make judgments about reality. So my point is, like, if you compare, not only, if you put the statement in its context, as wild, as radical as it was then, I think it looks mild vis-a-vis what's going on right now.
Right.
And the best example of this is this, one of the, huge lies of Trumpism, which is the idea that you don't need to wear a mask. And to me, that is the perfect example, and I talk about this in the book. That is kind of out of the fascist playbook. And in the sense that, what is a better example that this belief in lies that eventually can be lethal than the president's own refusal to wear a mask, which is kind of dangerous. So the point is that, if we want proof that Trump believes the stuff he says, well, this is a perfect example because he's putting himself in danger. Science will tell us, because of not wearing a mask and, in terms of his interactions with people and even huge crowds. So that's even risky for himself, but he believes in this. And this goes back to other examples, which were more consequential, perhaps in terms of, the horrible outcomes that they provided, such as the Holocaust or Hitler's war. Hitler himself thought that Nazism was so formidable that it didn't matter, in terms of military numbers, which were the chances. He was sure that they would win a war on all fronts against the Russians and the Americans. And he was willing to risk everything, including his own life, for that. And he did. So you might say, okay, sometimes this kind of belief in lies is certainly more problematic than hypocritical politicians, because of hypocritical politicians at some point will stop. And I think even the Bush administration somehow stopped its unchecked wars.
Yeah.
And here, certainly in fascism, you don't see that. They go to the end. And they sacrifice even themselves for the lies. And the bad part, of course, is that they sacrifice many other innocent lives along the way. And we see something similar, or let's say we see many parallels with what's going on with the coronavirus in this country.
So the lies of a Bush administration are tactical on some level, although, that quote to me sounds like, there's a distinct rejection of, material, intangible reality. But the lies of a fascistic leader are existential on some level. And but when you describe someone who is asserting a truth that is demonstrably false, and they believe that they have a more direct line to a hidden truth, which certainly sounds like Donald Trump, but it also sounds like a madman, like someone. That's almost like the definition of someone who is clinically deluded.
In the sense that it is in every psychotic, you see an attempt to deny and escape from reality. Now, but to me, I argue against that idea in the book in the sense that, I'm not that interested about whether, Trump is clinically deranged, because to me, I'm interested in the politics of this.
Right.
Which is to say that these are lies that are believed by many, and the leader believes that he personifies the truth. He personifies the truth because he is part of a cult. He's part of a political religion where he's a godlike figure. Hitler saw that like that, and I think we see instances of this in Trump as well. Now, the point is that what do the fascists do when reality does not conform to their lies? Because this is the risky, the kind of the kind of very dangerous dimension of this.
Yes, that to me sounds like you're describing the Republican National Convention that's going to take place in a month or so.
Yes, I agree. It's a perfect example of extremists believing the lies of the leader. But now the problem is that this affects, it might affect the entire city of Jacksonville and the rest of us.
Well, yes, we're seeing it in Arizona. We're seeing it in Florida. We're seeing it in Texas right now. Yeah.
The best example of this, horrible example, by the way, is that, the Nazis, one of the big lies of the Nazis was that Jews were dirty and they spread disease. This was a big, big lie. So let's say a non-fascist person would say, yeah, well, this cannot be proven by reality. It means then that it might be false. So the fascists did not think that because Hitler said so. And basically what they did, as you know, is turn reality into a lie. But in a way, reality changed and the lie became a reality. What I mean, let me be explicit about this. So Jews were certainly not dirty and certainly did not spread disease. But the Nazis created artificial conditions in ghettos and concentration camps where, with horrible unsanitary conditions, with, lack of food, violence, and so on and so forth, Jews eventually in concentration camps and ghettos became dirty and spread disease. So the fascists eventually will say, you see, Hitler was right because Jews are dirty and spread disease. But this was based on the fascists' successful attempt to turn a lie into reality. Go ahead.
Well, that actually is, I think, that example was what inspired my recalling this quote, frankly, which was, you look at the situation as it is, and we create our own reality, and that's exactly what was done there.
Yes, and the quote, in my book you can find, from the 1920s and 30s, some fascists arguing similar things. I have, for example, an Argentine fascist in the book, famous fascist Leopoldo Lugones said, it's not that we don't believe in empirical truth, but we believe in a truth that transcends and is more important than empirical truth. And this truth is absolute, it's the truth of a religion, and it's a truth which is based on faith, not in faith in the leader. It's not based on data. So here, the paradox here, or the one contradiction here, is that what fascists, and I will add Trumpists, understand as the truth, the rest of us, we have to regard it as a lie because it cannot be demonstrated. In fact, it is, reality demonstrates against its tenets or its axioms. So the idea that masks are, are not useful against the virus, well, that's the idea. That's a lie.
Right.
So this is how it works. I was, in my 7 books on fascist dictators and populists, the key issue for me is not only how it works, but why people believe in this. What is the mechanism that allows people or prompts people to believe in this? And one of them is the belief in a leader that knows it all.
And it's just easier to sort of outsource those questions, right? This is I think, studies of Orthodox practice of religion is a similar dynamic where people just modernity or whatever the era that they're living in, it's much easier to sort of outsource, like, your as many questions and answers to those questions as you can. What do I wear today? Well, one of the benefits of practicing a highly orthodox religion is that that answer's there for you before you wake up. What do I eat? That's already there. What don't I eat? That's already there for you. I mean, these are questions. It gives you a very rigid guidebook on how to live your life.
Yes, I mean, but here the big problem is that this fanatic way of being religious is displaced into politics, and thereby it becomes violent and lethal, because what used to belong to the sphere of religion now is part, is the alpha and omega of politics. It's the center of politics, and this is this is how it works. So basically, what you have is a leader that believes himself to be a god or a god-like figure, and he believes his followers should follow him accordingly. So you have this displacement of religion into the political sphere, and the result and the outcome is intolerance. Because, I mean, how can you argue against one's own faith? This is not demonstrable. It's a matter of it's a matter of belief, not of demonstration. But when this is applied to politics, it's very problematic because it leaves the rest of us as being unfaithful.
To what extent, in your study of fascism, is fascism a function of capitalism and the commensurate economic immiseration that occurs within a capitalist system?
Well, I mean, fascism, in the beginning, many people believed that fascism was just a branch of capitalism. And history demonstrated that it's much more complicated than that, because fascism works well with capitalism. Certainly, fascism is always a right-wing ideology and is never against capitalism. But it has its own imperatives. So sometimes, eventually, German capitalists did not want the destruction of Germany that Hitler provided. Eventually, but they work really well, for some time. So the big mistake, I think, by conservatives and even capitalists, is to believe that they can ride the horse. That in a way that is the wrong, that is mistaken. So fascism worked well with capitalism until capitalism, or let's say capitalist or economic imperatives, became a problem. As you know, instead of using trains to help the war economy, Nazis decided to use those trains to kill Jews.
Right.
And this was not based on a capitalist logic. Now, there is another element here, another layer, which is equally problematic. Let's say, in the same way that they model themselves after capitalism, because the Nazis, particularly when they killed, but they changed, they reformulated the entire thing, because if in Fordism or Taylorism, what you had, in a capitalist line of production, was producing obviously wealth and a product, what the Nazis did is create a kind of line of production to produce death, not surplus value or not profit. So the profit for the Nazis eventually was death. Their priority was to kill, not to earn money. If they could earn money along the way, great.
Okay, and so that dynamic of the capitalists, thinking they can ride that horse, and the fascists in their extreme version are they're not seeking, like you say, a profit. Are the circumstances of capitalism sometimes giving birth to the horse, as it were?
An excellent historian of fascism, Jeff Ely, also an historian of the left, he has a really good idea about this, that there are certain political and economic situations that, at least in the 1920s, they were fascist-producing situations, let's say. Obviously, if you have a political crisis coupled with an economic crisis, you had this, let's say you have an entry point or a pathway for this kind of magical solutions to very complex problems. So in a way, fascism thrives on crisis, certainly.
Fair enough.
But on the other hand, if you focus on Trump, the economic situation wasn't that bad, but he was in a way faking the situation of an economic situation. He denounced an economic crisis which was not there. So here we return to the issue of lies. In a way, it doesn't matter as much whether you have an actual political crisis or an actual economic crisis, but whether lies about those things, whether these lies are believed.
It's a fascinating look at something that I got to say, kudos on the timing.
Well,
I wish I couldn't say that, but yeah, the timing.
Me too. Me too.
Well, the book is A Brief History of Fascist Lives, Federico Finchelstein. We will put that. We will put a link to that book at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, folks. We're going to head into the fun half of the program in a moment. Just a reminder, it's your support that makes this show possible. By becoming a member, you support the live show, and we give you extra content every day, almost every day. Next week, we're going to be on vacation. We're going to give you brand new interviews. Really some interesting, very interesting interviews. But I don't know, we may throw in some of the archive stuff too. But certainly on the vast majority of days, we give you extra content for you to enjoy. You can become a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. If you do not have the finances to become a member, but you want the extra content, send us an email, majorityreporters@gmail.com. Put in membership in the subject line and give it some time. We will get to it. I promise you, we will get to it. Sometimes it feels like an eternity, but we will definitely get there for you. And don't forget, justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority, get 10% off. We have our merch. Our merch has gone crazy.
I'm losing it, bro.
The I'm losing it, bro line of Majority Report t-shirts have been blockbuster pre-orders. This, of course, was a well, I don't know if it was a brainchild. What is that? What am I thinking of? Brainchild? What is that? Is it brainchild? Is that the right word? Sometimes you say words like that, and that sounds...
Yeah, it's weird language, but I think that is the word you're thinking of.
It is. Brainchild of John Benjamin. In fact, it wasn't even really a brainchild. It was really more of like a brain spasm.
That seems like a 90s marketing term, brainchild.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just sometimes you say words, and then you, like, do people really say that? It was actually really more of a brain spasm of John Benjamin's, and he just I'm
losing it, bro.
he's having troubles, and we put it on a t-shirt, and now you can buy it, and all the proceeds of that t-shirt go to Skid Row Trust, which is an organization that supports the unhoused in Los Angeles. So every dollar of profit there goes to skidrow.org, I think it is, but it's the Skid Row Trust. So you can check that out. Also, we have other things at the Majority Report. Remember, the masks, all the proceeds of the masks go to the Pacific Northwest Immigration Center. So those masks as well. And we have t-shirts. I keep meaning to wear some swag. That was some, merchandise, but we will get there eventually. Also, the AM Quickie, you can sign up for that at amquickie.com. And with us, joining us for the fun half, Bill Fletcher was on your show this week.
Bill Fletcher Jr., great guest, and good to see you, Sam.
Nice to see you, Michael. I see. Are you graduating?
Graduate.
Is that like you have the purple like robe? That was a sash that would signify that you had gotten your master's degree, I believe.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken. It is the season. Yeah.
It is the season. If only it were so. Bill Fletcher Jr. was the guest. We talked about everything from what does building a 21st century labor movement actually look like, different periods of Reconstruction and how it relates to the Trump agenda, and also some of the themes in Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains book, which I like to periodically recommend people read that book.
Nancy was right.
Nancy was completely right. And the distinction that if you're talking about Trump, if you're using this fascist terminology to compare Trump to like something from Europe, that's pretty ahistorical and silly. But if you recognize that America has absolutely something that could be situated as a fascist tradition, very much organic to this country, it flows right out of that. And that's also how you can understand how Mitch McConnell runs the Senate. We also talked about saving the post office, and in the post game, I guess I had a lot of hot takes. I had to have my own spin on this whole right-wing populism drama. Jesus Christ, actually listened to Sam Harris's entire BLM response, which
awful.
Wowza.
Truly awful.
Really?
I was saying in the segment that, for better, I've changed some of the things that I think in the last couple of years. Some of them, and just going in and not having listened or read anything by Sam Harris ever since I finished my book, and just being like, has anything been upgraded? No.
Nothing.
Literally nothing. Is
Sam Harris as popular as he was before? He doesn't seem to be in the conversation as much.
No, he's not. But it's an interesting conversation in general to me, because I just feel like we're so deep into everybody's into their own silo that because it's like, no, he's nowhere near in the conversation that he was, but he still has, 1 million followers.
Right.
He still has a ton of people listening to him. He still has well-selling books. So when I think about it, Rogan has a mass audience, although again, even he, we'll see how that changes when he goes to Spotify.
Right.
There's a lot of people like Russell Brand. I keep tabs on Russell Brand, and of course, he's got a huge audience, but you got to seek him out. And it just seems to me that that's kind of increasingly true of everybody.
Yeah.
I guess so. But I have a feeling that I think Harris was.
No, his brand's gone down.
He was in the conversation more because because of the foil that he had, right? He could say yes. You could do, during the Obama years, you could, he could be Obama adjacent, but still introduce these right-wing ideas that, were edgy. But now it's just we've now taken your ideas to their proper conclusion, and it's Laura Ingraham.
Right. Well, actually, that was what Matt said. Matt was he's gearing up for the Biden era. And I think there's some truth to that.
Right. Winding up. We're going to have, they're tearing down the statues. And
he's not into all this. No, he's into the most.
He's stop resisting arrest. Literally.
Black Lives Matter should be training people to stop resisting arrest. And then, I won't go into it too much, but it's classic Sam, because there's a lot of of course you need police reform. And of course we need to, do stuff about the war on drugs. Here's one example of a police killing that is really unjustifiable, and this person should get charged with murder. Now, I want to debate and get into a very bizarre dispute on the merits of the Eric Garner case, as an example. And also, cops don't get enough training. They don't know how to use their guns properly and stuff, which again, it's every available piece of evidence we have is that cops are overtrained when it comes to inflicting violence on people, and undertrained when it comes to de-escalating. And
I think that it is the case that they probably don't get certainly they don't get as much training with their guns as you would imagine. But I would also argue that you could make them all sharpshooters, that they could hit a soda can from 150 yards away, and it wouldn't change a single thing.
It wouldn't change the mentality, but there's that killology school that a lot of people have reported on. I mean, they do, to the extent they do get training and resources are put, it is into martial application. So I guess the notion that
they're just acculturated to this notion that they are going into war, and I'm not convinced that making them better sharpshooters I have the ability to plug somebody in the knee as opposed to aiming for their chest or something is going to make any difference whatsoever.
Precisely.
That's the one beautiful thing about Sam Harris that I think it's like I totally agree with you, except for these material points that completely change the whole spirit of that agreement.
Yeah, precision. Exactly.
But if I keep it vague enough, and stay on this level and then go dig down into the minutia, which supposedly provides a greater explanation and a negation of that agreement, but I don't explicitly say that, then I can say that you are putting words in my mouth.
That's exactly it. I have to say on the flip side that I enjoyed, maybe because it's annoyed me that people have been trying to pressure me to say this slogan, which to me right now, there isn't much meaning to the slogan. So in the conversation with Bill Fletcher Jr., when we were talking about defund the police and capitalist policing and the reforms that could be done today, that could be significant, and then the deeper stuff that would have to require systemic economic change, he definitely, he was like, and I say defund because we're not abolishing cops. There's always going to be some type of cop. And then he was like, told a pretty traumatic personal story, which you could listen to, about his daughter. And he was just like, what am I going to do? Call up Ghostbusters on this guy? Or argue politics with him?
Well, we would have
he's like, there's going to be a function, whether we call it that or not, of policing. And I just, especially in the context, I mean, Bill Fletcher's a serious scholar and radical. And I appreciated that demand to really think with precision about this stuff, so we actually can accomplish things, because slogans can turn into anything.
Well, defund also polls poorly, actually, but reinvest,
definitely, yes,
reinvest, or disinvest and reinvest, but whatever. I mean, I think there's been a lot gained, and it's bringing people out into the streets, and that's going to have much more efficacy anyways. All right. We got to take a break and head into the fun half in a moment. But also, I want to remind you, check out Nomiki's show. You can find the patreon.com, the Nomiki Show. And also on youtube.com/the Nomiki Show. And check out the Antifada. Jamie's got a whole slate of things going on at the Antifada, and as well as her Vampire Castle, talking about vampires. Matt, what's happening on Literary Hangover's Twitch stream?
Twitch.tv/literary hangover. I've been hitting the high seas and learning about the Revolutionary Atlantic. Also, there will be a new episode for patrons coming up, the third part of my essay or episode on George Orwell's Lion and the Unicorn, and I'll release the first two parts publicly finally Saturday then too. So some new podcast content coming from Literary Hangover.
All right, and we have we're doing a special today on our transition into the fun half. And who did this?
This is Slug McBlob.
Slug McBob. The voice sounds familiar to me a little bit, but I don't know if it's him. I mean, it's obviously Slug McBlob, but I don't know who that is. But I don't know where this came from. But it's I think it's pretty amazing. It's also, I mean, we're going to play in the fun half, the Mario Brothers, like mashup of this show and Mario Brothers. I don't know what to tell you.
I just saw that before we went on, and I won't be spoiling anything, but the noise that Dave Rubin makes when you knock him out is the funniest.
Yeah. I don't know if we're going to get to that level, but
oh my God, that was what made. I mean, the whole thing is great. It's very creative, but I was dying at that.
I just saw this one too. We're going to do this. We'll see you in the fun half, 646-257-3920. Here it is, folks. You may want to stick around for this.
He's the man with the PhD, and you will see such a right winner, because the man is way of sin, but don't go in. The day of big mama boys has passed. Alpha males are taking control fast. For the beta male knows when he has his hand. It's the kiss of the death from Mr. Gorka Finger. He's the man with the bad intent. Looks like David Brent. Fascist words he will pour in your ear, but his lies can't disguise what you fear. For the beta male knows when he has his hand. It's the kiss of the death from Mr. Gorka Finger. He's the man with the big fat head. Eats lots of bread. He only eats bread. So much bread. Big fat head. He only eats bread. So much bread. Big fat head.
Wow. That was very bizarre.
That was very odd. People are getting, I think, like there's a little bit of cabin fever that must be going around. I have a feeling.
Yeah.
I think so.
You know, Michael, you mentioned Killology, and what's funny about that book, that the guy who wrote Killology about telling cops how to kill and, you know, not feel bad about it, has never killed himself. And which is kind of like the White Fragility book written by about how white people can't understand racism by a white woman, but
by a white lady who's HR bullshit artist. Basically, that companies hire to insulate themselves from discrimination suits. Yes, that is analogous. Wow, I'm still.
Yep.
I need to go take a nap.
Oh my God.
Just from watching.
You have no idea.
Jesus Christ. I'm sure he does eat a lot of bread. He's probably tried to not eat bread. I'm sure that Gorka's attempted Atkins at one time or another.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. I'm sure he's gone through a lot of them. All right. Well, let's play this. This is funny. We'll start off with this funny video before we go on to the phones. This is a guys from Boston. This guy, Joe Messina show. Now, this is, of course, not actually the Joe Messina show. It is from Not Even a Show, where I guess they just captured this video of this cop calling into Joe Messina's show. And it's, and I think they may have mixed up the editing a little bit, but it's pretty funny. Let's watch this.
Steve
What's
from
called
Idaho
the real side
joins me. Steve, thanks for calling. Appreciate it. All right. Maybe if I hit the right button, you'd be there.
That's fine, Joe. No problem. We all make mistakes. Thank you for taking my call, sir. I appreciate it. I don't know if you were briefed exactly on what my situation is, but I am law enforcement here in Idaho.
I am a police officer, and I just wanted to call in about that, sir.
Well, listen, God bless you, and I mean that sincerely. I come from a family of Boston police officers, and I know what you guys go through, and I can't even imagine what you're putting up with these days.
Yeah,
but I want you to know that
you can't.
we
That's
support
right.
you.
That's right, because you can't. You're a civilian, so you can't. So you shouldn't try to. I appreciate you trying to, but what we do is absolutely something that cannot be quantified by a civilian. And the people that are coming after us and saying, "Oh, all police are bad. All police are bad."
Well, does that mean that I am bad?
Does that mean that I am bad? Am I not supposed to do my job, Joe? I'm just watching on the screen. You look like you're kind of smirking at me. Do you have some kind of problem?
No, and you need to relax. I just told you how much I supported you guys, okay?
I need to relax. I need to relax. I'm a police officer. I am a boy in blue. I don't relax. You relax.
Okay.
I don't relax. You relax.
This is not helping your cause. You're talking to me. I'm here supporting you, and you're talking to me. And what I'm telling you is
People are not supporting us, Joe. They're out here, and they're giving us this and that and saying all
I'm not out there
bad.
giving you that. I'm trying to help you. I'm not out there giving you this stuff.
Okay,
right?
Joe, I just called it to give a different idea to show people that us police officers are normal people. We are out here trying our best. Yeah, That's right. You better agree. You better agree.
Oh, God.
That is the funniest thing that I've heard in weeks.
Yeah, well, it's really funny. It's really funny how the host just immediately becomes so docile, right? I mean, in that situation, really pathetic of that host to immediately just become so docile. But let's go to the phones. Calling from a 208 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hello, this is Officer Steve from the Idaho Falls Police Department. I understand you just played a clip of mine, sir.
Oh, I didn't. That wasn't.
Okay, so if you want to shut up for a second, that would be great. I'm actually in control of the conversation. You can shut up. You can listen for a second. It might do you a little bit of good, okay? All you young people are basically the same, in my opinion. You're shouting ACAB all the time. All cops are bad. All cops are bad. Meanwhile, you don't respect the fact that we're human beings just like you, dealing with the same human being issues that you do, Sam.
Officer.
Like last week, my wife left me because she doesn't feel safe in the house anymore. That's the issue we all deal with, sir.
Yes. Well, I should tell you, I'm probably older than you are.
Do you want to back up maybe a bit and stop that you have sort of an aggressive stance right now?
I'm sorry.
And I'm curious why you're doing that.
I didn't mean to get. You just said young people, and I was just saying that I think I'm probably older than you are.
So I want to talk about that video that you just played and sort of how misleading it was. I feel as if you play that in order to sort of slander me, but it's a very misleading video, and it sort of misrepresents the interaction that I had with that particular host.
I didn't change anything from the video.
Well, but you don't see the context for it. You don't see before the video starts, and you don't see after the video ends. You're just seeing a small little portion of it. We did a full investigation into this, Sam, and we found absolutely no wrongdoing whatsoever. And I will say this. My life has been hell ever since this clip went viral after it got played on the Not Even a Show that you can find at youtube.com/Not Even a Show. Bye.
I wouldn't know why. Wow. You hang up?
Wow.
I mean, bad move.
Why would you, if you were worried about the clip, why would you promote youtube.com, Not Even a Show, as a way of seeing it to people if you had a problem with the clip? Wouldn't you just not mention Not Even a Show? It's on YouTube.
He's a cop, sir.
It's weird.
I don't get the, and we watched it. Did we take it out of context? I don't think so. Maybe. I mean, people could go to Not Even a Show on YouTube and see it, but why would you promote the link if you don't?
As Sam Harris would say, I'd recommend you watch that again.
Really
look at what's going on here.
If people want to share it with other people.
The host is interrupting him multiple times. He's goading him.
Yep.
He's saying that he supports him with a smirk.
Yeah. No, honestly, that host, the way he gets docile is the Sam Harris. That's what he wants you to do. Just if a cop is just completely flying off the handle. Just, yes, sir, I'm on your side.
Sam Harris basically wants you to not have involuntary body reflexes while life drains out of your body while some psychopath is strangling you.
If Sam Harris was stopped by a cop.
He's anticipated this, Sam.
What's that?
I slogged through the whole, and he said at one point, if the cops were looking for some guy that looked like Ben Stiller, I would be pissed off. I would be confused, but I would cooperate.
I would cooperate by saying, "Do you know who my mom was?"
Yeah, exactly.
Are you aware of soap?
Ever heard of it?
Did you ever see the program Golden Girls? Well,
I remember it was vintage, but I remember that in the in defense of profiling article, he said that he would be profiled according to his. I bet it would be really rough. Yep.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the crap show that is our response to the pandemic. There's a pandemic, Michael. I'm not sure.
Once in 100-year pandemic, Sam.
What's that?
Like a once in 100-year pandemic.
Well, let's hope so.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, right. Exactly. Fair enough.
At least once in the trailing 100 years, there is reason to believe, and when I spoke to one of the early interviews we did with an epidemiologist, I asked him, "What's your biggest fear?" And I said, "After this," and he says, "COVID 2022." Because he's like, the reason why people have been predicting this, particularly over the last 20 years, has been the change in the climate and the human expansion into areas, into every corner of the planet. And so, I think it was SARS or MERS that was a function of a kid who was playing in her backyard. I think it was a little girl or a little boy playing in their backyard. And, the development had been so much that it had taken, more out of the jungle, and they were exposed to a virus from some bats, I think it was, that had never been there before. But, the other day, a virus that pigs now apparently have. There's some scientists who are afraid it may make the jump. I mean, who knows? But hopefully, knock on wood, it's a once in every 100 years. Here is Anthony Fauci, this guy who is obviously deep state, trying to undermine Donald Trump.
CIA, Fauci.
CIA, Hillary Clinton, deep state, Barack Obama, deep state.
It's all people who wear masks.
Addressing the Senate Committee on Health and Education and Labor and Pensions that had a hearing in the wake of, the surge that we're seeing, and we're still in wave 1, folks. It's just that we got a big country, so that wave just takes a while before it hits the other shore.
I am also quite concerned about what we are seeing evolve right now in several of the states. As you know, in 4 of the states, in Florida, Texas, California, and Arizona, more than 50% of the new infections are in those areas where we're seeing surges. The things we need to do, I think you alluded to in your question to me, we've got to make sure that when states start to try and open again, they need to follow the guidelines that have been very carefully laid out with regard to checkpoints. What we've seen in several states are different iterations of that, perhaps maybe in some going too quickly and skipping over some of the checkpoints. But even in states in which the leadership, in the form of the governors and the mayors, did it right with the right recommendations, what we saw visually in clips and in photographs of individuals in the community doing an all or none phenomenon, which is dangerous. And by all or none, I mean either be locked down or open up in a way where you see people at bars not wearing masks, not avoiding crowds, not paying attention to physical distancing. I think we need to emphasize the responsibility that we have both as individuals and as part of a societal effort to end the epidemic, that we all have to play a part in that. And I think if you look at the visuals, what we saw were a lot of people who maybe felt that because they think they are invulnerable, and we know many young people are not because they're getting serious disease, that therefore they're getting infected has nothing at all to do with anyone else, when in fact it does. Because if a person gets infected, they may not be symptomatic, but they could pass it to someone else, who passes it to someone else, who then makes someone's grandmother, grandfather, sick uncle, or a leukemic child on chemotherapy get sick and die. We've got to get that message out that we are all in this together.
We are now 4 months in to this pandemic in the United States. 4 months of when basically the first lockdowns happened. The idea that concept is not out at this point leads me to believe that it's not going to get out through the means that Fauci is looking for. Like at one point, Fauci has to make a decision. Is his, and I feel for the guy, is his presence in this administration actually achieving what he hoped it would? And would he achieve that goal? Could he promote that goal more by leaving at this point? I mean, he's up there saying this, and it's not like, there's no federal leadership here. There's anything, it's to the contrary. And so, how, do you make I just wonder if Fauci at this point, because the federal response has been so anemic and irrelevant, if he couldn't do better by, 2 weeks in the news of going basically rogue and saying, I'm quitting because the administration is just simply not taking this seriously. There's no point in me being here. I'm better off as a private citizen. He'll get like a week's worth of media to go out and be much more explicit. But now he's got to be sort of like, diplomatic about it. And, none of these states opened up applying the 14 benchmarks that the CDC recommended. New York, at the very least, has decided that phase 3 or 4 is not going to include indoor seating at restaurants. I mean, right. Thank goodness for small favors. But the bottom line is, like, we don't have the capacity as a society, as a comprehensive society now, to really make priorities. What should be the priority? I mean, from my perspective, as a father of a small kid, I want schools to be open, and the economic activity, that's just not sustainable this way. The government needs to obviously give money to people to stay at home. They need to do all the things in terms of alleviating rent and whatnot. But in terms of opening up, like, where do you spend? In New York, for instance, we have created essentially a certain amount of slack in the system. There's a certain amount of leeway. Where do we expend that leeway? Like, where, is it people going to, indoor restaurants or to bars, or is it going to be sending kids to school? Like, that's basically the choice that we're at now. And Fauci's got to come out and be more explicit. And I think he's just, he's being too diplomatic because he's got a problem within the administration. And
yeah, he has a completely thankless task. I wonder, I think from a media perspective, it would be more effective maybe if he quit. Although frankly, whatever even, look, he's already demonized by right-wing media anyways. It wouldn't make difference one way or another. But if he left, yeah, I think from a media perspective. But I wonder, I would like to know more about his role, because I do wonder if there's still some aspect of bureaucratic power where he's cushioning some things on the back end, which I have no idea.
I wonder, right.
I wonder too. I have no clue. I wonder what his calculus is. I'm not interested in, romantic, the guy's not perfect like anybody else, but he seems pretty sincere and diligent in his work. And so I'm kind of willing to maybe give him the benefit of the doubt as to why there's a reason he hasn't quit yet, because it's very obvious that he's not only is he not being listened to, he's a target of media, and he's also, regularly undermined by other forces of the administration. Real quick, we can't even handle.
On that point, all right. So you've made the argument that maybe Fauci has some administrative value that he is aware of that we're not aware of, which we wouldn't be, and he sees it as he makes an assessment as to whether he should resign from the administration, because at one point he's got to. It seems to me like it's just like his efficacy. He's not going to hang on until the next one, and so. At one point, it's like, how much can he impact how this is going? And so far, it hasn't been great. Now, maybe he's thinking in his head, well, if Texas and Arizona and parts of California and Florida in particular, if they get so bad that maybe they will start to listen. My response to him, if that's what his thinking would be, let me introduce you to Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, whose state is, the number of new infections in that state is breaking a record practically every single day. Here is Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick on the Laura Ingraham program.
Reality is a lot different. We've had 2,424 people die, and New York has had over 31,000. Even California has had almost 3 times as much as Texas. And remember, Laura, those 2 states have been locked down the whole time while we have been open. So locking down doesn't work. If it did, those 2 states would be doing better than Texas. Fauci said today that he's concerned about states like Texas that skipped over certain things. He doesn't know what he's talking about. We haven't skipped over anything. The only thing I'm skipping over is listening to him. You have a lot of doctors on your show from day one. Your doctors have been right almost every time, and he has been wrong every time on every issue. I don't need his advice anymore. We'll listen to a lot of science. We'll listen to a lot of doctors, and Governor Abbott, myself, and other state leaders will make the decision. No, thank you, Dr. Fauci.
Number one,
they're running against him. Like they're leveraging him as a political weapon.
And Texas is skyrocketing. And also just, track this disconnect as you watch these people. That one part of the message is we've already gone over this, but this isn't a big deal. We're going to listen to the science and we're not going to be hysterical. And then on the other hand, this is the guy, and he was just a couple of weeks too early. We were still actually shocked by this as a society. We still thought hitting 100,000 deaths was completely unacceptable. So he got ahead of himself. He should have waited 3 or 4 weeks. But this is the same guy who in the first couple of weeks of this gave the most nakedly social Darwin position I've ever seen publicly expressed by an elected official. And this is in Trump's America. This guy said on Fox News, grandparents should be ready to kill themselves so people can get out to work. So I actually take I think he's been completely consistent in not listening to public health advice from the beginning. I just don't think it's science that's driving it.
Right. And let's remember,
not to mention ethics.
For years, it was the death panels of Obamacare, which was the animating issue for the right wing in this country, which was the idea that we would, in some way, there would be an assessment as to cost-effective mechanisms that would be that based upon efficiency, these panels would refuse to pay for certain procedures for people that would cause them to die. And meanwhile, and it's like Granny's going to be at a death panel. And in fact, the Patrick is like one man death panel.
One man death demands. And also, I always want to note this too. New York, Columbia University put out a study that said if the lockdown had begun a week earlier, I think it was upwards of 30,000 people might not have died. Yep. And that is primarily people dying in New York in the beginning. Yep. So New York, not only was it not some liberal overreach, if you look at the release of people to nursing homes, the delay of a lockdown, New York was insanely reckless and disgusting. And de Blasio and Cuomo bear responsibility for that as well.
Without a doubt. The Cuomo in particular gets no credit for moving people into nursing homes. And the reason why they had to do that was because of all the budget cuts.
Yep.
And I'm not convinced that he didn't do it. And I think we'll get more of the real story about this, over the years, but over the months, maybe years that follow. But I'm not convinced that he didn't do that as a way of hiding the deficit of public hospital beds so that he could move forward with the cutting of Medicaid that was teed up at that time. I'm quite convinced that the cutting of Medicaid drove a lot of the decisions that were there to hide the deficit of beds that we had for public hospitals in this state. Really disgusting. But at the very least, after he realized that he had killed thousands of people who shouldn't have died, or was, I should say, responsible for the deaths of thousands that could have been avoided had he not been concerned about budgetary issues, he became more responsible in these things, as opposed to Governor Ron DeSantis, who it appears will refuse to recognize reality and is just going to ride this thing all the way down. Here is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis saying, despite the fact that there's been this explosive growth in infections, and again, average age is in the mid-30s, so you're not seeing this show up in terms of deaths yet. Maybe you won't. Hard to believe you won't, but maybe you won't. All you're getting are people who are having long-term implications, long-term health implications from this. But here's DeSantis insisting that we're not gonna do anything different.
We're not going back, closing things. I don't think that really is what's driving it. I mean, people going to business is not what's driving it. I think when you see the younger folks, I think a lot of it is more just social interactions, and so that's natural. Obviously, you had a lot of different activities going on in different parts of the state. Memorial Day, the 2 weeks after Memorial Day, we saw a lot of stuff going on. So that's just the reality. But we're open. We know who we need to protect. Most of the folks in those younger demographics, although we want them to be mindful of what's going on, are just simply much, much less at risk.
Here's a guy who's really protecting his future in electoral politics, right? I mean, he must have aspirations someday to run, and he's just hoping that he can get through this, and praying that he's basically just rolling the dice. That's basically
100%. I want to just say, I mean, look, this is from June 19th in the Tampa Bay Times. Public health experts and aid groups are challenging Governor Ron DeSantis' assertion this week that migrant farm workers are driving Florida's record surge in COVID-19 cases, noting that the state help with testing, face masks, educational outreach has been late to reach agricultural communities. And that same week, DeSantis said the number one outbreak we've seen is in agricultural communities, following his statements that, quote unquote, overwhelmingly Hispanic farm workers and day laborers are leading sources of the cases. So, that's the double. From
those folks to young folks. And then next week, we'll see who else he's going to blame.
And that's what we've said from the very beginning, though, is that it's going to be some combination of, don't worry about it. Or to the extent this is something to worry about, it's the migrants.
Right. The thing I like about Tucker Carlson is he's such an independent thinker. This guy's not.
It's tough for a couple of weeks before an election, Sam.
He's not some type of party shill. This guy, and here he is. Want to make it clear, just in case you didn't get the message. You've been watching Tucker Carlson. You've been bathing in all his right-wing populism. He just wants to make it absolutely clear where the home for you folks who want to fight the elites is. Forget for a moment the 200 judges who have been put on the federal judiciary, who I guarantee you, in every single opportunity they have to rule in favor of corporations, big money, to strip individuals for rights of redress against corporations, to strip workers and consumers and citizens of any type of protections they have in our society. They will rule every time in favor of those moneyed interests that Tucker Carlson bemoans.
And by the way, when they rule the right way, sorry, you were loading up vacationing. Where is he vacationing? I'm sorry.
As he goes in between his 3 or 4 abodes, waiting for his parents to die so he can become a multi. I mean, he's probably already a multimillionaire. But,
yeah, I think he's doing.
But I'd be like 100 a millionaire or whatever you call that. Here he is. He's going to tell you now, the only institution, as flawed as it is, that will protect you and your interests against all of these corporations and these elites.
But to remind the Republican Party that it is our only shield. Yes, the Republican Party, flawed and infuriating though it often is, the fact remains the GOP is the only institution still open to the rest of us, to Americans who want to live as they did just 15 years ago, quietly, productively, without being harassed and harangued by self-righteous lunatics who mean them harm, and they do. If you want to be left alone to do your job and raise your family in this country, you will need a protector. That protector must be the Republican Party. There are no other options, but it must be a very different kind of Republican Party. Keep in mind, we're getting a new Republican Party no matter what happens. Even now, vultures wait just off stage to swoop in and claim the GOP for themselves once Donald Trump is gone.
The imagery there, right? And the idea of like the haranguing and harassing that you're getting, right? Like, this isn't his left-wing populism anymore. It is just like, it is completely cultural, And in fact, that's what, I mean, this isn't right-wing populism. All the right-wing populism is this cultural war. It's all the culture fight. And he can talk about.
That's interesting, though, the way he's pivoting on it, because I would draw some distinctions between the aggressive cultural warfare that he usually does overtly, and Bannon and everybody else. This sort of like actually getting back to live in peace, leave you alone, is weirdly analogous to what Biden's offering in terms of how Biden is framing getting back to quote unquote normal. It's like where you're drawing normal. And it's also weird that he's.
But what is it?
That's like a libertarian signal in a way. That's very odd.
The haranguing and harassing by the
you need to go and crush people on the streets. I mean, we've already talked about that. That's been his main thing.
What is the haranguing and harassment that people are getting now? This isn't. I'll tell you why it's not libertarian, because it's not government overreach he's complaining about. I mean, what is the haranguing, harassing he's talking about? He's talking about
like
women asserting themselves in the workplace, insofar as like, Me Too stuff. He's talking about Black people asserting themselves and saying like, hey, we don't want to be occupied. We don't want to be policed by an occupying force.
But remember the origins, but again, this is where it all merges, because you go back to the origins of libertarian politics. That was substantively what they were complaining about too.
Yes, but
the federal government is
not even pretending to dress up.
Yeah.
Because the federal government is not harassing them, right? It's not like a neo-Confederate argument. It's strictly a cultural one.
We played a video of him like a year ago where he's like, who's going to stand up for us if Nike is going to give Kaepernick a commercial? Like fundamentally, all this is they're mad at like the elites in boardrooms who are saying, actually, it makes better financial sense for our business to not be racist. Like that's the problem he has with the elites now. And I mean, that's what the IDW, I think that's the sentiment it cultivates.
And here he is again, like this is Tucker Carlson again. And remember, he's made the argument that it's about harassing and haranguing. And so now he's layering in some other measure of economic insecurity, supposedly, which is, listen to what Tucker Carlson says here.
Country. They are our hope for the future, our only hope. And yet both parties have shamelessly abandoned them. Middle-class families have no national spokesman. They have no lobby in Washington. Republicans pretend to be their champion. You know by now that they are not. Instead of improving the lives of their voters, the party feeds them a steady diet of mindless symbolic victories, partisan junk food designed to make them feel full even as they waste away. Who cares how many Benghazi hearings we have? We're supposed to care. Why should we? How did Peter Strzok's text messages become more important than saving American jobs from foreign nationals who are taking them? It is lunacy. We fall for it every time. And to the extent this show has participated in it, we apologize with deepest sincerity.
Oh, God.
Because meanwhile, as we're talking about things that don't matter, life for the dwindling American middle class has become steadily worse. Suddenly there are junkies living in your park. Your nephew just died of a fentanyl overdose. And saddest of all, and who hasn't thought this, you've realized that your children will never be as successful as you are. The American dream died with your generation. As all of this happened, Democrats laughed because it served their interests. Republicans basically ignored it, and that cannot continue. The only political movements that endure are the ones that make their voters stronger. So how does this change? Can Republican office holders change their party? Yes, they can. We just have to make them. These are not, by and large, evil people. Mike Braun is not an evil person. Despite the way they talk, they're not secretly working for the other side. Most of them are just empty, sad people. And politics is the way they fill the yawning void inside where a personal life should be. They're pleasers. They're searching for the approval of strangers. Our job is to give them clear instructions about what we want. We do that by voting and by making noise. They will not lead us. We know that now. They've refused to. We have to lead. And when we do, they will follow. Johnny Burke is the executive.
Like, what?
There's a lot being conflated there.
Oh my gosh. And
there is so much being conflated there.
And what is also fascinating about this is that there is no, like what concrete proposals is he highlighting at any given time that would in any way empower the people he's talking about?
Well, in the past, and it's really interesting, and I don't watch Tucker all the time, or even actually, I mean, honestly, ever. I just watch these clips. But I noticed in outside of the, further away from the election, he would occasionally talk about breaking up an Amazon.
Right.
Or, there needs to be some upper, some top marginal tax increases. And it's very interesting that the closer that the rubber hits the road, the way less specific you can be, because none of those things are happening. Yes, like Josh Hawley's got some decent legislation on a few things or whatever, but with regards to Amazon specifically or tech monopolies. But the bottom line is that none of this stuff is coming from the Trump administration, including when absolutely, I thought at the beginning of COVID.
And none's coming, frankly, from the Republican Party. Yes, there are one or two
individuals, people working on this or that issue. But Mitch McConnell's going to shepherd an antitrust agenda through. Come on, let's be serious. So it needs to be, and then the other part that's interesting is that is a one-to-one. Bill Fletcher put it much more historically and entirely differently last night. But yes, the Democratic leadership in corporate America will show up in kente cloth and present symbolic nonsense without actual material accomplishments. Yes, that's exactly right. The difference being is that in the Republicans' case, there is a part of the base of the party. There is a part of the party that's getting catered to, and that's the donor class. And I would argue with actually Democrats as well. But it's the clarifying thing to me, at least, about the right-wing populism thing, and there's a lot of other stuff to set aside, and there's different things that we could debate. But the bottom line is like, if you don't have an understanding or a framework of conflict between capital and labor, then everything else to me really is just window dressing, to the point where the actual concrete examples that these guys can marshal of not having strict supply side positions are a couple of decent positions on antitrust, trade positions that are actually, if you dig into them, potentially even worse, because they're basically just bilateral agreements that drive down standards potentially even more than the WTO frameworks. And then some stuff that It's good. Raise top marginal rates. That's Clinton Gore 92. It's not really that exciting, guys.
Exactly.
And nothing about labor unions.
And
that is such a
undoubtedly
dividing
are not,
line.
Yes, of course. And those marginal, Joe Biden was out there yesterday saying, "Look, to his donors, like I'm going to raise corporate rates to 7% less than they were before Donald Trump lowered them."
That's right.
So I mean, this is the way that it creeps down. Bill Clinton did the same thing.
Yep.
He lowered that. He took the Reagan gave us the capital gains tax decoupled from income tax, and then Clinton came in. He's like, I'm going to raise those. Okay, but you're still 10 years. You're still significantly less on those taxes than you were 10 years ago in this country, and that's what Biden's going to do, and the idea of we drop them 15 points and then we raise them 7. And look at that. I'm raising the marginal tax rates. Give me a number and, then and make that confiscatory at, for people over, I don't know, making $5 million a year. I want, 90 cents on the dollar after that.
Absolutely. And
whatever,
that's, and
4 million, 3 million, whatever the number is. I don't care.
And it's as Dustin Guastalo, I always recommend people read. I mean, he's like, look, if you absolutely, and I think it is important to think through these things clearly. Like Steve Bannon represents something different in terms of a pitch and argument than Mitch McConnell. But if you push any of these folks like Bannon on labor unions, they sound like country club Republicans. And that is just because, to me, unions are not only a question of this or that policy or rate. It's a question of reorienting power away from capital to labor. And that is, there might be a socially moderate person who supports that. I'll be quick to add. There might be people who are like, yeah, I'm pro-choice and so on, but I'm not super invested in, various cultural controversies. Yes, that exists. But a right-wing version of that, and that's why every single, Tucker segment, what does he do? He outlines problems and then he pivots to immigration. Which again, it's not even just that it's morally wrong. It's also that that is actually the direct inhibitor of being able to build and renew a mass base of organizing, which is definitionally multi-identity. That's not even a moral statement. It's just literal order of operations.
Calling from an 810 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hi, my name's Alex. I'm from Michigan.
Alex from Michigan. What's on your mind?
Oh, of course. Stand by, sir. Let me put you off Bluetooth like everybody else. I forgot.
All right.
Hey, all right. I'm probably going to sound like a centrist lefty, so let me couch where I'm coming from before I pose this question.
All right. Will you just back off your phone just a little bit? You're clear, but you're a little bit distorted.
How's that?
That's great.
All right. So I have risked my career by marching in the recent Black Lives Matter protests. I was, even when I was a teenager, working on the Kerry campaign because I genuinely hold leftist beliefs. But I find it very frustrating when people on our side lose focus. And a question which I'm happy to take off the air is, how can we stop ourselves from fractioning? To give an example, I was at the marches and I was hearing people say, F the police, which, a lot of us are not wanting that. A lot of us are saying, yeah, defund the police. I'm not saying all cops are bad. Or tearing down Confederate statues. A lot of us are for that. But then an equally terrible, Teddy Roosevelt statue gets teared down, and our messaging goes to heck. I'm trying not to say curse words. So my question is, how can we focus our messaging, essentially like Fox News does, but on the left?
Yes, we cannot. I mean, I think that, like, we can endeavor to do that, but it's a different type of person who's engaged in this. And I think on the left, there is I think, part of the reason why you get emancipation movements on the left like this, and part of the reason why you get these type of movements, is because a tendency of the people on the left not to march in lockstep. It would be great if there was message discipline, and it would be great if, personally, my prescription for these things is, let's have people, everybody go in their casual Friday gear to these protests and be very polite, and and so that there's images of cops, smacking, what appears to be casual Friday business folks with batons. That would make it, much harder, like even much more to although I think, frankly, the population has changed a little bit, so that's not as relevant. But I'm saying, I just think that, yes, it would be good if there was more message discipline, but I think it's also possible to get too concerned about that and let those frustrations undercut what you're doing. I mean, without a doubt, like, and it used to be like you go to an anti-war rally and there was like 40 different other messages that were being put out there. And I think it would, in some ways, it would some way dilute, the main thrust of what's going on. I think, but I think energy on the streets, anything that continues that energy, and part of that messaging maybe happens on a media level, and on some level, we have more media than we've had in the past to dictate these things. People have more opportunity on like Twitter to sort of shape how that message hits journalists. So I
think
I hear you and I feel you, but I would also not get too concerned about it.
I would also maybe reframe it as I talk with this guy Joshua Kahn Russell a lot about the actual mechanics of how movements work, and like actual, because that's his life. Like he's not a media person. He actually works and does these things tactically in a variety of contexts. And there are principles of basically trying to build cohesion and sustainability to things. And I do think people need to think in those terms. I think the idea of message discipline is a funny, like at some point in the last 15 years, everybody started to think of themselves as like media people or freelance political consultants or something. And I guess a lot of us did become that.
I mean,
I
mean, like
a lot of it, but
social media, I mean,
totally. And I think sometimes, there's an incentive structure on social media specifically that doesn't necessarily harmonize with, because you could think to yourself, like, all right, what is the most like wild slogan or provocative thing I can say to a small segment of people to get the most clicks, is not necessarily the same goal as what sustains a mass movement to achieve.
I think they're largely very often in opposition.
Absolutely. So I think the more interesting version of the question, if I was to extrapolate from what he was getting at, is not, you can't just say like, I mean, I probably would agree with some of his criticisms, but you can't just go to a protest or something and think that your particular lines are where things should end. But if you want to rethink of how does movements start to sustain themselves and achieve material gains with all these other contradictory incentive structures, I think that is urgent to think about. And I think you got to start looking at sources, frankly, and I'll plug Joshua because he's a friend, but just as somebody I know, it's like, but also like Adolph Reed. One of the reasons I admire him so much is he's not only a great academic. I mean, they've done a lot of work in the healthcare campaign in South Carolina, coming from the unions. It's really effective. And, I think more of that perspective of people just literally working on whether it's protests or door to door or whatever. What does it take to sustain that? Yes. Is a whole other question.
Well, there's organizing on one hand to build an infrastructure that is more than slogan deep. And then there's this other dynamic of like, I think people on the left, broadly speaking, generally there is, I think, just in the makeup of people, and I would say the vast majority of people listen to this show and are engaged in this stuff, all perceive themselves on some level. I think, if you are on the left, you are more open to new ideas, different ideas, a wider range of people. You tend to explore things, and I think that type of mentality also breeds like a sense of like, I've got the idea that is going to be the idea that's going to work.
I think that's true. And I think
shows up at the rally with like, no, this slogan, that slogan. And
there's a tension there, right? Because again, I'm not trying to,
of course.
Well, not only, I'm saying though, also inside it, because I think in some ways, of course, there's more of an intellectual openness, but there's also a huge amount of dogmatism. And that does start to reflect when it becomes just slogan deep and I have my slogan and that's like the be all end all. I think like, you have to be open beyond that, particularly when you're talking tactically.
There's Brian Kilmeade, who is going to explain to you the concept of the fallacy of sunk costs.
Really?
Yes.
Brian Kilmeade's going to explain
Brian
that to
Kilmeade
me?
is going to explain to you the fallacy of sunk costs.
All right, I'm ready.
In the context of the Afghanistan war.
Here's the other thing that really drove home to the American people who are paying attention. The Russians have every intention of filling the gap when we leave. After 19 years, are you willing to turn our influence in the Afghan government over to the Russians and to the Iranians? Is that going to be the apt reward for 19 years of sacrifice by the American men and women who fought there?
No, listen, we are committed to the people of Afghanistan, and we have been. In fact,
we're leaving.
You point out we've spent 19 years of blood and treasure there, and in the Bush administration, I worked very hard on rule of law in Afghanistan, and we love the people of Afghanistan. What the president's been able to do is develop a peace agreement with the Taliban to keep our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines from being targeted by the Taliban. And we're also encouraging inter-Afghan negotiations, because at the end of the day, we can't be in these places forever. And the Afghan people have to come together. They have to reach a consensus. They have to go on with their lives. And we're facilitating those negotiations.
Did you tell the Russians they have to go on, Robert? Did you tell the Russians they have to go on with their lives?
Well, listen, the Russians left Afghanistan, their military left Afghanistan a long time ago under much different circumstances. But look, they have intelligence in Afghanistan, just like we do, just like many countries have intelligence operators in Afghanistan. It's near them, and they certainly want to look out for their own interests. We're certainly going to do everything we can to counter the Russians. We're going to counter the Iranians, and we've shown that more than anyone. I mean, we've taken the strongest action against Iran that any administration's ever taken. So we're going to look after our Afghan partners, but at the same time, we're going to bring our American men and women, servicemen and women, home after 19 years of fighting in Afghanistan for sure.
I mean,
He's so upset. I mean, the idea that you're sitting in that studio and and that somebody whose leg has been blown off, who's coming home to a pandemic depression, is like, no. Don't take me home to my family in urgent medical care, or don't just get me out of Afghanistan. The Russians might increase their interest here.
Well, listen, it's not inconceivable to me that men and women who served over there are coming home going like, wait, what was that for? Why was I there? Why was I there in 2010? Why was I there in 2015? Why was I there in 2008? Why was I there? Of course. I have no doubt that many of those people are like, are you telling me that I saw my friend get killed, or I lost my leg, or this and that, and that's it? We're just, and I don't blame them for feeling that.
Well, I think those questions go towards the policy, not towards what about the Russians?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, the point isn't the point is that we went in there. When we went in there, we were told we are not going to make the same mistake. We are not going to leave this country in ruins. We're going to go in. We were sold this whole bill of goods about how we were going to build up Afghan civil society, and we were going to create infrastructure and blah, 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 blah. That's the way that we entered in there. And it was all a lie. It was a lie from the beginning. Everybody sort of knew it was a lie. They were going just to go and get the Taliban because they had protected bin Laden. They let bin Laden get away because they basically put all their resources into Iraq as soon as they possibly could. Literally took military personnel who were on the heels of bin Laden and moved them to Iraq. And the bottom line is we should have gotten out 15 years ago so that we wouldn't have expended that stuff. And, you know, we're leaving the country in worse shape than we found it, essentially the exact same thing. And we left it decimated. And, you know, we were told we're not going to do the same thing that we did, you know, when we funded the madrasas to go fight in the Mujahideen, to go fight the Russians. We're not going to leave it a disaster area. That's just going to be, and we are, because there's no will whatsoever to actually go in there and do any type of like genuine. I don't even know if it's possible at this point.
It's not. I mean, you got to read. I mean, I'll just plug Steve Call's 2 books on this: Ghost Wars, which covers 79 to 2001, and Directorate S, which covers 2001 to 2016. I mean, it's not. Not only is it not possible, I mean, these things are also, in your favorite phrase, they're self-licking ice cream cones. The relationship between the Pakistanis and the U.S., the dynamic from the very beginning, completely separate. You want to talk about specific, highly targeted intelligence and potentially military operations around a ultra specific set of people that may have been there and left very early, namely Al Qaeda and bin Laden. Yes, absolutely. But we went in there right out of the gate. The torture program started, the complete destabilization, enormous civilian casualties, people settling old scores by passing fake intelligence on other people so that innocent people could show up at a military base to have a conversation, wind up in Guantanamo. The whole infrastructure was there from the very beginning. And I think also part of it, you know, that was the opportunity that people like Dick Cheney wanted to not only invade multiple countries, but to explicitly reject. It's not like U.S. administrations respected international law in any way before, but they wanted to explicitly say, we're not even going to pretend to do that.
Right.
We are going to rip up this infrastructure. And I mean, yeah. And by this point, too, when we're even talking about the Taliban, what are we even talking about? I mean, honestly, a lot of these groups, there's nothing like not supportive of them, obviously. They're not noble, whatever. But the basic sentiment, get the hell out of my country, is correct.
Nice beard, as you say. You're not supporting the Taliban. Calling from a 970 area code.
Hey, Sam. This is Steve from Colorado.
Steve from Colorado, what's on your mind?
Hey, I was just going to say that, you know, it's kind of bad that, you know, Romanoff didn't win.
Yeah.
Sucks.
But I wanted to talk to you about, you know, just the weird participation thing that's been going on. Even in a state like Colorado, you know, like we got mail-in ballots. And, you know, we do get some sort of, you know, more liberal, you know, things passing by. But, like, a lot of people, even out here.
You're breaking up.
I was just saying that it's, you know, no matter what, it's more, sorry, I live on the side of a cliff, man. So,
well, we're all feeling it these days.
Yeah, so it's just, yeah, it's weird, like, that all this is going on. And then, you know, I'm trying to also, like, try to set up something because, you know, I did, you know, canvas for Bernie. I've been canvassing for a lot of people.
Yeah, you got to get to the point. I'm not clear what you're saying. What's the point?
Yeah, I'm just saying that there's, you know, I feel like there's a lot of people who are not getting how the whole process works, even still, you know.
What
you know, like
what process? What process? Voting process?
Oh, just voting. Yeah. Just like the primary and the, you know how a primary works, and then to a general election, because people were over here thinking, like, oh, I'm voting for, the Republican or the Democrat. I know someone who voted, for one ballot and then put another ballot in. You can't do that out here,
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, look, Steve, I'll tell you this: we need more education about voting. I mean, we should be making voting days holidays. We should obviously be doing vote by mail. Nationally, it's going to take a while for people to understand the process. But yes, it's a real problem. If people think that they can vote in both primaries, we have a messed up process. Now, with that said,
in New York, I vote in 3 primaries. I wish you had that luxury.
But here's the thing: in Colorado, they have a caucus and a primary. And so Romanoff won the caucus,
right?
But it was irrelevant for the primary. And so it is like, that is confusing. There's no doubt about it. Like, I don't know why you have 2 of those things. We could simplify the process. I'm not convinced that a lot of times these extra layers of complication are a function of, like, the more complicated you make these things, the people who have control of the apparatus have the advantage. Right? Because they can you create a complicated system, and then you have you control the apparatus. You can make it simpler for some people that you want to have access to it. So there needs to be a reform across the board with these things. And it's going to take a while, particularly in a state like Colorado, where it's, just slowly turning blue, as it were. And you need to create a stronger movement on the left, I think, to communicate that. Let's go to calling from a 702 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hey, Sam. Hey, Mike. It's Bro Flamingo from Las Vegas.
Bro Flamingo from Las Vegas. How are you,
doing?
Sir? What's on your mind?
Hey, a big shout out to Mike, by the way, dude. I love your list of histories on Patrice Lumumba and Sankara. Very, very good. Love that.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
Sorry, guys. I just want to talk about 2 things real quick. Well, Mike kind of beat me to the punch on this one, but it's just really funny how Sam Harris is trying to make his comeback on this, like, that sleepy voice dribble that he comes out with, and I listened to like half of it, and it was just like, dude, like if I wanted to listen to this stuff, I'll just listen to the Nazi stuff and just move on. Like, I don't know, I feel like it's kind of passed him by. As a matter of fact, Sam, he only has like 425,000 subscribers on his channel. You already blew him out the water. So it's kind of weird, like, seeing him come back in this time, trying to make a splash. And I just kind of felt like, dude, like, it's kind of irrelevant at this point. I don't know, even like the Weinsteins and stuff. And like, Mike, you kind of pointed it out, where these guys just harped on stuff where the stakes were just so low, and they just never moved on from it. And The last thing I wanted to talk about. Also, my book came out. Boom. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And the last thing I want to talk about. Sorry, go ahead. Guys, I think this is important. Clearly the economy is in the shitter, right? And I'm sorry, I keep cursing. I apologize. The economy is really doing really, really poorly.
Yep.
I want to ask a question where, like, doesn't Donald Trump really have to cut the check? I'm talking about the stimulus and unemployment stuff for him to even have a chance of re-election. And how does that play just with the ideological entrenchment of the Senate Republicans? Because I don't think they're going to go for that. At least Mitch McConnell's not going to go. Oh, I think we'll see more stimulus because of the states it's hitting and because of the spreading out of the geography of who it's impacting, both in terms of state and population, and because of Trump's reelect. I actually definitely think it won't be big or meaningful, but I'm sure Trump will do some type of, like, that could be his October surprise. Everybody, the Treasury's cutting everybody a $2,000 check. I would be very ready for that.
And I would say this, that if, the Senate, I think my sense is that this is a negotiation posture by McConnell more than anything else. But if the Republicans are reluctant to put money out there, right, I think that could be an indication of, like, maybe they're not so convinced that Donald Trump is going to win. And they're starting to already lay the groundwork for pushing for austerity with Joe Biden. I think the problem they're going to have, though, is is the filibuster, but we'll talk about that in a
And
minute.
also their own candidates in competitive races. I mean, it's one thing as an overall strategic posture, but Cory Gardner doesn't want to be running around Colorado saying like, nope, sorry.
Right.
Also, just last thing, guys, I'll quickly jump. I just also think that to your point, though, Sam, and everything, and also to Mike's point where, there's also competitive races and stuff, he's going to have to cut the check. And any of those guys sitting there just kind of still pushing the austerity garbage in this time, they're probably going to lose. Leftist best guys, also all cops are bastards. Take care, everybody.
Appreciate it.
Take care. Well, I don't think, unfortunately, Mitch McConnell's not going to lose, but we would have had a hell of a race if Booker was the nominee.
Much better shot.
Oh my!
I mean, I think there's.
I mean, a much better shot, and also just an intrinsically valuable race. I mean, a much better shot, and something that would have clarified the stakes on any number of levels. But
you would have had a better shot. I don't know that he could win, but you would also build an infrastructure in Kentucky around a guy who's much more dynamic and is going to bring in much more excitement and much more voters that are going to be lasting in an era when maybe people aren't voting against Donald Trump, but they're actually voting for something affirmative.
Exactly.
And you could have nationalized that race a lot more.
100%. That would have been the most. I mean, look, presidency is presidency, so it's most important. But that would have been the most crucial race in the country, without a doubt.
Chuck Schumer. I mean, I don't. Who knows what Chuck Schumer's intent was in this? If it was just to get somebody in office who's going to win, who's going to be to the right of him, because it makes it much easier, or if it's also just part of a broader plan where he's just so incapable of having any type of political imagination that a female vet just sounds too perfect to him, or if it's also maybe like there was a time where the Red Sox, they would sacrifice winning the World Series to get into the playoffs. In other words, we can't afford to have a full rebuilding year because we want to keep people's interest through the playoffs. But because we're not going to do a rebuilding year, we'll never get to the World Series. And I'm not convinced that Chuck Schumer's like, we're going to have a playoffs and Mitch McConnell will be protected. Like Amy McGrath has definitionally a ceiling because she's just, there's just not enough of those votes in a place like Kentucky to go and fishing in Republican waters. And that's what she was trying to do. Right? She was trying to say, like, I'm going to work with Donald Trump.
More than Mitch McConnell. That's what she said in her opening, her first interview. Yeah.
But speaking of Mitch McConnell, here is Mitch McConnell. And I will tell you this, like Joe Manchin has already come out and said, I'm not going to get rid of the filibuster. But guys like Coons are starting to, articulate a chance of it. And all of these candidates, to be fair, who are running for, Senate seats, Democratic candidates, are entertaining the idea of the filibuster. Here's Mitch McConnell trying to basically threaten Democrats. Don't start thinking about this. And folks, you can listen to this and then you can try and guess what my response is to Mitch McConnell.
Senator, can I ask you, some Democratic senators are already discussing getting rid of the legislative filibuster if they win the Senate. What is your response to that? And also, if you keep the majority, will you consider getting rid of the legislative filibuster?
Well, I consistently said no to the current president on that issue, and he tweeted about me a number of times, which I greatly appreciated. And let me say, I think the important thing for our Democratic friends to remember is that you may not be in total control in the future. And anytime you start fiddling around with the rules of the Senate, I think you always need to put yourself in the other fellow's shoes and just imagine what might happen when the winds shift. With regard to the changes that have occurred on the executive calendar, really that's a very recent phenomenon. Even though it was possible on the executive calendar to filibuster nominees, it just wasn't done until Bush 43 got elected. And ironically, the current Democratic leader of the Senate was the ringleader in starting to filibuster on the executive calendar. And then Senator Reid undid that. And where we are today on the executive calendar is right back where we were for 200 years prior to Bush 43. So that's not really a revolution. what would be a revolution is to turn the Senate into the House, would be to change the legislative filibuster. I'm not through. So do I feel strongly about it? You bet. And if there are any responsible Democratic senators left who aren't going to be stampeded by the hard left, they ought to take a pause and think about whether they really think it's a good idea for the country to put the one institution that guaranteed that America stayed in the middle of the road into the same place as the House.
You know, honestly, the short answer I have for Mitch McConnell is go F yourself. The idea that he's not even bringing up, Merrick Garland, the idea that he's not bringing up the fact that they got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. It is time. And the Senate will never be the House until there is some measure of democracy in the way that senators are elected. The fact of the matter is that the idea that, people in the size of of half a borough in New York control more votes than, all of New York City, like the number of votes that are controlled. Well, we have a situation in the Senate. Simply, you can put it this way. Something like 46% of the country, dominates the Senate. It doesn't make any sense. And so it's never going to be the House because it's never going to be elected with such a level of democracy. But if you're going to introduce any measure of democratic reform, small d democratic reform, the way you do that is by getting rid of the filibuster. And fine, if Mitch McConnell wants to sit atop legislation, it is time to that is revanchist and regressive. Let them own it. Let them own it. Absolutely. It is time for masks off, and this is going to increase accountability. It will still provide folks like Joe Manchin. That's why Joe Manchin, I would love there to be no filibuster. If the Democrats take the Senate with like 1 or 2 votes, Joe Manchin is
he's the man.
He's loving it because he's suddenly the fulcrum. He's the guy who can make or break any type of these Democratic initiatives. So it would give him a lot of power. So, but Mitch McConnell, go F yourself. Any Democrat senator who listens to Mitch McConnell's warnings at this point is a fool or lying. Period.
Yes, that Manchin, that'll be like 3/4 horrifying corporate giveaways, and 1/4 like West Virginia is going to get the bacon, man. Woo.
Yeah, exactly.
that guy knows how to. He knows how to play that angle. That's why he's such a survivor.
Hey, let's play this other clip from Slug McBob. They went to a lot of work. This is pretty impressive stuff. Slug McBob is the YouTube channel that did the Gorka finger. And for those of you who are big fans of Mario Brothers video game, I was never a huge Mario Brothers guy. I always like a first-person shooter. These like a Mario Brothers, a little tame for me back in the day. And but I no longer have the mustache. And I just want to personally apologize to whoever Slug McBob is for shaving the mustache just upon your release of this, because it is a work of art, and I appreciate. I mean, just the idea that I could be a muse for this type of level of art is incredibly gratifying, and I appreciate it. And here it is. And we're not going to be able to do this justice. You got to track down this video. We'll put a link to it in our blog post in our YouTube because there's multiple levels of this, and each one is as rewarding as the one that precedes it.
mysermonsandwich.com. mysermonsandwich.com.
I'm not a public figure, folks. I'm just a little guy. I'm not like as powerful and as well known as Mike Cervantes.
Who's laughing now, Sam?
Skip ahead.
My brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas. Who's laughing now, Sam?
No, you don't have to fast forward it. There it is. There it is. That's pretty cool.
I like that.
There's multiple levels. I mean, I don't know how long you watched that, Michael, but there's multiple levels.
That was about when I checked out, but well done.
But it is fascinating.
Bastard.
All right, let's take one or two more phone calls, and we will. Oh, here's Brian Kilmeade. Let's do this one too. Brian Kilmeade's really on fire these days. He wants. He doesn't want us to give up all the gains that we've gotten from Afghanistan, and now he's going to tell New Yorkers what it's going to be like without cops around to mess with you.
There will be fewer cops on the streets of New York City to keep people safe.
And don't let anyone kid you. They're not going full steam ahead either. They have had it with the disrespect. They have had it with the lack of backing from this mayor. And they are sitting there saying, hey.
What Kilmeade's launching into here. There is a reduction in the police budget in New York City by over the course of I don't know how many years, $1 billion. The annual budget for the police in New York City is something like $5 or $6 billion, isn't it, or something like that?
Six.
In Kilmeade is saying, well, they're going to cut the budget, but the other thing is they're not going to do their job. And here's my response: name me a single other situation where Brian Kilmeade wouldn't say, hey, if they're not going to do their job, they should be fired or they should have their budget cuts. But here it's we should fund this organization that is going to leverage their doing their job if they don't get. This is extortion. He is praising the extortion by the police.
Full steam ahead either. They have had it with the disrespect. They have had it with the lack of backing from this mayor. And they are sitting there saying, hey, city management and sadly New York City residents, you're going to get a taste of what life is like with a diminished police force, which were lauded around the globe when Ray Kelly was in charge. And this isn't a reflection on the new police commissioner. It's a reflection on the management of this city led by a reluctant mayor who was reelected twice because only 20% of New Yorkers decided to show up to vote. And this once lauded and sought after NYPD, people just come here to train, to learn how to get their police force up to snuff around the globe. We have this unit that goes from different countries to find out, from Jordan to Israel to Saudi Arabia, to find out what's the next terror attack that's going to be hitting us. They're as good as maybe the FBI in this small little area. So now we have a situation where we have less men and women on the street. We have no anti-crime force to let us know where the next hit will be. And we have shootings up something at 8%. Murders are up 49%. We are in the middle of self-inflicted chaos in New York City.
That's why a lot of people are moving out of New York City. So in this new budget, they're reducing overtime. They're canceling the July Police Academy class. All those men and women that were excited about joining the force, nope. Delaying a new fleet of vehicles. They're canceling the cadet class of 2021. And they're moving the school crossing guards and they're moving the school safety agents and moving the homeless engagement unit for the NYPD over to the DOE. A lot of people are upset about this, including Bernie Carrick, who used to be the commissioner. He was around here in New York when things were really bad here, when it was unsafe, and then went through the transition period under Rudy Giuliani.
Bernie Carrick is a convicted felon.
I mean,
and also basically used a 9/11 first responders apartment to have an affair. I mean, kudos.
Very nice.
but the idea
Bernie Carrick can take a 9/11 to Mecca.
The idea that school crossing guards are going to be under the auspices of the Department of Education now, as opposed to the cops, I'm terrified at that. And I got news for you. The idea that people are moving out of New York City because of cuts in the police force, as opposed to, let's say, well, maybe they're worried about a pandemic, is absurd.
Go with the pandemic, but I want to just say, I want to, one, I look forward to Kilmeade's coverage of the next teachers' strikes.
Right.
And secondly, this, though, we already went through this several years ago when they walked out, when de Blasio, they got pissed at de Blasio over something. I don't even remember what. And what that meant in a very positive sense then was that they weren't doing broken windows garbage. And the proof was that that crime continued to go down and they were just harassing way less people. So that was very positive and should have been exploited. Some of the things that are happening now, and I've heard some of this anecdotally, because initially I thought all of the kind of reports on crime going up, I thought that was just pure lies, just sort of to put out. But I don't think it is. And I think there is some of that going on. And they've definitely they've gotten rid of some of their plainclothes anti-gun units. And, I'm hearing definitely a lot of anecdotal evidence that is actually leading to an increase in shootings. And that to me just goes back to something I've talked with Cedric Johnson about and Waz on this show, which is just like this obscene fusion of harassment and over policing and just systemic harassment of specific communities, combined with actually the class consequences of actually not taking serious crime seriously in the same places. And so you will see this. I mean, this is going to be a maneuver. And I want people to actually think, a little bit strategically about it, because if crime actually does start to go up, believe me, some of the kind of bougie people that are out, yelling about the police now, those attitudes are going to change in a heartbeat. And it reflects the same underlying dynamic, which is that certain communities along class and race lines are harassed and terrorized. And then actually their democratic public safety is not taken seriously either. And that's
Ghetto
exactly
side.
what they're doing in terms of retribution.
That book, Ghetto Side, covers that dynamic, I think.
Yeah.
All right, final call of the day. Calling from a 240 area code. Folks, I know a lot of folks have been holding, but we just ran out of time. 240, where are you calling from? What's your name?
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, this is Brianna from Bowling Green, Virginia.
Hello, Brianna. What's on your mind?
On my mind right now, speaking of Fox News and the right wing, I've seen a lot of talk there saying, how Bernie and AOC are going to be pulling the strings behind the Joe Biden administration, and Joe Biden's just going to be the figurehead for the radical left.
I certainly hope so.
That's a good time. I'm just asking, it looks like Joe Biden is going to win in November. Now, a lot of could change from now until November, but it looks like he will win. So if and when Joe Biden wins, how much influence, and especially with all these wins for the left, for I don't know how many more wins we're going to have, what do you think the influence we're going to have realistically on the Joe Biden administration? How powerful, how much of a voice would Bernie and AOC actually have during those 4 years of Joe Biden?
Good question. Appreciate the call. I'll let you go and then we'll answer it. What do you think, Michael? And you know what? This is a good time too. Let's do a little predictions. Who do you think? I have an idea who I think now is going to be vice president, but who do you think is going to be the
that's a good question. I think it will either be Harris or Demings, and I'll try to be interesting and say Demings. Sure.
And what do you think about influence?
I think that really remains to be seen. And one thing that I want to caution people is I think that there's some progress, obviously, like Bowman is a great win. And, there's some people in there, but I don't think the left is nearly as strong as where we would want it to be. So, I actually find myself in the middle of these conversations. You got to get rid of Trump because, frankly, if you look at, Nancy McClayton's book, I mean, there's implications about even just the kind of basic mechanics of the capacity to do constitutional democracy with the Republican agenda. And I don't mean that and we all know that, but again, I don't mean that in any sort of conspiratorial sense. I mean, literally between the judges, between the strategies around voting, between labor cases, we're talking about undermining not only the capacity to defend a few gains, but certainly to make wins in the future. Yep. And that also implicates the Constitutional Convention, all of that. So you got to get rid of him. But I think the power of the left, I think there's big opportunity. It's
got to be more building. There's more building.
A lot more building.
All right. Here is my.
What are your two thoughts?
I'm largely my answer for the second question is the same as yours. I mean, I think that we still don't have the strength yet, and we've got to build on these things. But yes, the damage that is being done to, and I think it's, really incumbent upon people to remember that it's not just Donald Trump. We had an election in Colorado where a third QAnon supporter is now the nominee, and she won against a sitting Republican who had been in office for five terms, who was endorsed by Trump. The Republican Party has a real mental problem, and we'll go into that another time. But I am now of the mind that I think it's going to be Tammy Baldwin or Elizabeth Warren. I think it could be Warren, and I'll tell you why. This is why. I'll tell you why.
Baldwin, I like, by the way. Baldwin would be like my pick. If I was
I have a feeling it's going to be Warren, but this is why. Hill reporting yesterday. Joe Biden said that he's compiling a list of black women who could be nominees to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That is
now why you talk about that now?
Right.
I would believe would be because you want to lay the groundwork for maybe not picking a black woman for vice president. And yesterday, also, maybe it was the day before, Elizabeth Warren came out with a proposal for a national moratorium on evictions for a year. Now, I don't want to overstate the value of something like that because it really, we should be going much further than that. But that's a pretty big significant proposal, which I am not convinced she would have made if she felt like she was in the running to be vice president, unless she did that in consultation with the Biden campaign. In other words, she strikes me as the type of person, particularly based upon what we've seen, with like Hickenlooper endorsement and other things, that she is really trying to project a specific, centrist, amenability. And I don't think she would have done this unless she knew one of two things. One, that she was completely out of the running, which I can't imagine that anybody would assume that about themselves unless they did something like Amy Klobuchar did. Or, I think that she could be told it's definitely going to be somebody else. And until that announcement's made, she's going to stay in that race.
Right.
Or the Biden people have said, we want you to be even more amenable to the left and younger people who are interested in these type of things. So present this proposal, which is a good proposal. I mean, it's better than we have now. I would want more, but coming out with a year-long moratorium on evictions nationally would be pretty significant, it seems to me. And so there's
reports in places that have done that. I mean, anyways, it's a separate, that's good. It needs to be way more robust.
It needs to be robust. You need to have basically pay small renters. You need to get,
you need to pay, and you also need to really make sure. I mean, there's reports of, even in places where there's a moratorium, the landlord's like, okay, but I'm going to board the front windows of your house. Okay,
no,
but there's no, I'm just getting on a tangent because I'm concerned about that
I'm
issue.
just saying,
but that's interesting.
These are tea leaves as far as I'm concerned. So I'm putting this, I'm putting my stake down.
So I'm very boring. I think it's Harris or Demings. I do.
All right, folks, there it is. We will see you tomorrow. Michael, Matt, Brendan, good job today, guys. Thank you. Michael will be here tomorrow. I'll be back Friday to send us off on vacation. Are you aware? Next week, we're on vacation.
Sweet.
Michael. All right, folks. See you figuratively tomorrow.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the lie bar. But finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I guess I'm